there is something the ocean keeps from us. Not everything that has ever moved beneath those black and lightless miles has been named. Not everything that has ever surfaced. Slowly, impossibly, in the grey morning light of some forgotten coastline, has been believed. And yet, across more than 4,000 years of recorded human history, across every ocean on this earth, across cultures that never once spoke to one another, sailors kept returning to port and telling the same story. Something was out there, something enormous, something that moved like no fish they had ever seen, that rose from the deep with the patience of a thing that had never learned to be afraid, and that slipped back beneath the surface, as though the sea itself had simply exhaled. They called it many things. The Norse knew it as the Orm, the great worm of open water, a creature so vast that sailors mistook its coils for a chain of islands and dropped anchor in its flesh. The ancient Greeks wrote of the Cetus, a serpentine leviathan sent by Poseidon himself to punish those who had displeased the gods. The sailors of medieval Europe called it simply the Sea Serpent, and they drew it into the margins of their maps, not as decoration but as a warning. Here be dragons. A practical note. A cartographer's quiet admission that beyond a certain line, the rules of the known world no longer applied. What did it look like? The accounts, when laid side by side, are striking in their consistency. Witnesses separated by centuries and entire oceans described the same creature. A neck like a horse, they said, long and muscular, rising 6, 8, sometimes 12 feet above the waterline, turning slowly from side to side as though surveying the surface world with calm curiosity. Eyes wide and dark, set far back on a flattened, angular head, a body that continued beneath the water for an extraordinary distance. Witnesses estimated lengths ranging from 60 feet to 300, the creature's back breaking the surface in a series of dark, rolling humps, like a chain of small hills moving in formation against the tide. The skin described most often as smooth and dark, almost black when wet, sometimes shimmering faintly with a greenish or blue-gray iridescence in certain light. No fins in the conventional sense. A movement through the water that was vertical, undulating up and down rather than side to side, which is notably not how any known large fish moves, but is precisely how a marine mammal, or something mammal-adjacent, would propel itself. This detail has never been satisfactorily explained away. The nature of the creature, based on the accumulated testimony, was not one of relentless aggression. That is perhaps the most surprising thing. Unlike the kraken, which was said to hunt, to seize, to drag ships and men and light itself down into the dark, the sea serpent was most often described as indifferent. It surfaced, it observed, sometimes it paced a vessel for miles, maintaining an easy distance, its great head tilted slightly, in the manner of an animal that is curious but not hungry. Many accounts describe a long moment of mutual stillness, sailors frozen at the rail, the creature holding its position in the swell, before it simply submerged again, leaving nothing behind but the gentle rocking of disturbed water and the silence that follows, something vast. It was not, by most accounts, looking for trouble. But trouble, should it have come, would have found it magnificently equipped to meet it. Consider the physics of the creature described. A body of 300 feet, even at a conservative weight-to-length ratio, would represent a mass measured in the hundreds of tons. The neck alone, thick as a tree, braced by whatever internal architecture kept it raised above the surface against the pull of gravity, would have been a weapon of extraordinary capability. A single lateral strike from such a neck could shatter the hull of any wooden sailing vessel in any century before the iron-hulled age. The speed implied by certain accounts, the creature outpacing a sailing ship running before a full wind, suggests musculature of a kind that simply has no equivalent in the animal kingdom as we presently understand it. It would not have needed teeth to be formidable, though witnesses gave it those as well. It would not have needed venom, though some accounts, particularly from Southeast Asia, attributed a biological radiance to its presence, a bioluminescent glow visible at depth that preceded its arrival like a warning lamp carried up from the abyss. It would have been, in almost any confrontation with anything that has ever lived in the surface world, the largest and most powerful animal in the water. And yet, it surfaced. It looked, and then it left. That restraint, perhaps more than anything else, is what makes the sea serpent so enduring a mystery. We are not frightened only of things that want to harm us. We are frightened, in a quieter and more lasting way, of things whose intentions we cannot read, of things that look at us from a great distance with enormous dark eyes and simply wait. The sea still keeps its secrets. It always has. Come, let us go looking for them together. Chapter 1. The Ancient World and Its Witnesses. Let us begin at the beginning, or rather, let us begin at the earliest point at which human beings thought to write these things down, because the seeing almost certainly started long before the writing did. The year is approximately 2000 BCE. We are in Mesopotamia, in the flat and river-threaded land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in a civilization that built its cosmology outward from water. The Babylonians had a creature they called Tiamat, a primordial sea dragon, a being of salt water and chaos, older than the gods themselves, so large that her body, when she was finally slain, was split in two to form the sky and the earth. She was not a metaphor to them, or not entirely. She was a memory of something, a cultural imprint of an encounter, or a series of encounters, so profound and so terrifying that it had been absorbed into the very architecture of how they understood the universe, the way that only genuinely experienced things get absorbed into myth. We do not build creation stories around animals we have merely imagined. We build them around animals that, at some point, made us feel very small. Move westward now, across the centuries, and follow the Mediterranean. The ancient Egyptians recorded a creature they called Apep, or Apophis, in the Greek rendering, an enormous serpent of the deep waters who threatened to swallow the sun each night as it passed through the underworld on its journey toward morning. The symbolism is rich, and the theology is elaborate, but embedded within it, if you look carefully, is something rather specific, a creature of water, of enormous length, that existed in the darkness beneath the surface of things, and that posed an existential threat to the ordered world above. The Egyptians were not a people who invented freely. They were, in their art and their record-keeping, obsessively literal. Their serpent gods bore the proportions of real serpents, scaled upward. Their crocodile gods moved like crocodiles. Apep moved, in every depiction that survives, like something they had seen. But it is with the Greeks that the record becomes, for our purposes, genuinely useful. Because the Greeks, unlike many ancient cultures, made a habit of documentation. They wrote things down with a specificity that was, at times, almost scientific. And what they wrote down, again and again, in sources spanning 5 centuries, was the cetus. The word itself simply means great fish or sea monster. It is the root of our modern word cetacean, the order that contains whales and dolphins. But the creature the Greeks described was neither of those things. Homer referenced great sea beasts in the Odyssey. The waters through which Odysseus sailed were not empty of large and dangerous things, and Homer was too careful a writer to populate them with creatures he did not believe in. Aristotle, in his History of Animals, that extraordinary early attempt to catalogue and classify the living world, wrote with notable restraint about sea creatures of unusual size reported by sailors, noting that the depths of the ocean were not fully known, and that creatures of considerable length had been credibly reported in waters far from shore. This from a man who was otherwise skeptical, to the point of severity about unverified claims. That he noted these accounts rather than dismissing them is telling. The most specific Greek account comes from Megasthenes, a diplomat and historian of the 4th century BCE, who wrote about sea creatures seen in the Indian Ocean during the campaigns of Alexander the Great, creatures of such length that, when they surfaced beside the fleet, sailors could not see both ends of them from the deck of a trireme. He was not a superstitious man. He was, by all accounts, a careful observer. He wrote what the sailors told him, and what they told him was that the creature was real, and that it was longer than anything they had a word for. Now, cross the Mediterranean and move north. Follow the cold water up through what will one day become the seas of Scandinavia, where the light comes low and sideways in the long winters, and the ocean has a weight to it that southern seas do not. A darkness, even in summer, that suggests depth beyond reckoning. The Norse were perhaps the most thorough chroniclers of the sea serpent in the ancient and early medieval world, and this is likely because they were, above all other ancient peoples, a maritime culture. They did not merely cross the ocean, they lived on it. The sea was not a feature of their landscape. It was the landscape, the source of food and trade and war and story, the place where the world's real business was conducted. And so, when the Norse encountered something in the water that defied explanation, they did not file it away as a curiosity. They examined it, they argued about it, they wrote it into the Eddas and the sagas with the same matter-of-fact precision they applied to everything else. The German gander, the Midgard serpent, child of Loki, sibling of the great wolf Fenrir, was, in Norse cosmology, a creature so vast that it encircled the entire earth and held its own tail in its mouth. When it released that tail, the world would end. That is the mythological superstructure. But beneath it, if you read the sagas carefully, are accounts of real serpentine creatures seen in real water by real men. The orms, the great sea worms, appear in dozens of Norse accounts across a period of roughly 800 years, described with a consistency that is difficult to attribute to pure folklore. They were long, they were dark, they moved in vertical undulations. They surfaced near ships, observed them, and descended. They were not aggressive unless provoked, at which point several accounts make this clear. They were catastrophic. One saga account, which survives in fragmentary form, describes a crew that attempted to drive a great orm away from their fishing grounds by striking the water with oars and shouting. The creature, which had until that point been passive, turned toward the boat with what the account describes as a terrible patience, approached to within a few boat lengths, and then submerged directly beneath them. The boat was not destroyed, it was simply lifted, slowly, smoothly, impossibly, and set back down on the water, the way you might lift a leaf from a pond with your hand, and then the creature was gone. The crew rowed home in silence. Across the North Atlantic, in the waters that Norse longships were already exploring before the rest of Europe had conceived of the journey, similar encounters were recorded. The Norse settlement of Iceland brought settlers into waters that were, by any measure, unusually rich with large marine life. Waters cold enough to support creatures of extraordinary size, waters deep enough to conceal them between appearances. The Icelandic sagas contain multiple references to Scrimsel, a serpentine water creature of great length, sometimes reported in coastal waters, and sometimes in the large inland lakes that were then, as now, among the most isolated bodies of water in the world. In 1345, a creature fitting this description was reported in Laugaflagið, a long glacial lake in eastern Iceland, by a number of witnesses whose accounts were considered credible enough to be recorded in the official annals of the region. The Laugaflagið, as it became known, has been reported in that same lake by credible witnesses in every single century since, including the 21st. The water there is a dark and silty green. You cannot see more than a few inches below the surface. Whatever moves at depth in Laugaflagið does so in complete darkness, even on the brightest summer day. but return now to the broader ancient world, and to a question that has always pressed quietly against the edges of these accounts. Why the consistency? It would be one thing if Sea Serpent reports were chaotic. If some cultures described a creature with a dozen heads, others described something the size of a rowboat. Others described something with wings or legs or a voice. Myth, when freely invented, tends toward elaboration and contradiction. Different cultures invent different things, but the sea serpent, as described across Babylon and Egypt, and Greece and Rome and Scandinavia, and the island cultures of the Pacific, is strikingly, almost stubbornly, similar. A long neck, a large flat head, a vast body that remains mostly submerged, dark coloration, slow, deliberate movement, indifference to human vessels, unless those vessels become threatening. This is not the profile of a creature that was invented. Invented creatures do not behave consistently across cultures that never spoke to one another. Invented creatures do not observe ships with patience and then quietly leave. Invented creatures, particularly those born from fear, attack. They are reliably monstrous, because fear is not a subtle emotion, and the monsters it generates tend to reflect that. The sea serpent is subtle. It is curious. It has, in almost every ancient account, the behavior of something that has been watching us far longer than we have been watching it. The Roman author Pliny the Elder, in his encyclopedic Naturalis Historia, a work of such comprehensive ambition that it remains the most detailed record of ancient natural knowledge ever compiled, wrote about marine creatures of extraordinary size in terms that are neither dismissive nor sensationalized. He described, based on the accounts of sailors and military commanders whose credibility he evaluated carefully, a serpentine sea creature of great length that had been observed in both the Mediterranean and in the waters of the North Atlantic during Rome's northward military campaigns. He gave it no mythological framing. He listed it alongside whales and large sharks and other marine animals as a creature that demonstrably existed and had been seen by too many reliable witnesses to be discarded. He noted, with characteristic Roman directness, that the ocean was largely unexplored, that its depths were not known to any living person, and that any argument from the assumed limits of the known world was, in his judgment, premature. Pliny the Elder died in 79 CE, overcome by fumes while sailing toward Pompeii to investigate the eruption of Vesuvius firsthand. He was, to the last, a man who moved toward the unknown rather than away from it. He would have made, one suspects, an excellent witness. The ancient world closed slowly around its records. Libraries burned, empires fell, trade routes that had carried stories between cultures were severed one by one. But the ocean remained. The deep water, dark and cold and indifferent to human chronology, remained. And in those waters, something continued to surface, periodically, unhurriedly, and always just at the edge of what human eyes could hold before the light failed, or the distance grew too great, or the waters closed again and left nothing behind but the steady rolling of an empty sea. The ancient world had seen it, named it in a dozen languages without ever knowing the others had done the same. The medieval world was about to encounter it far more directly, and this time the witnesses would have names. Chapter 2: The Age of Sail. When the world was mapped and the serpent was everywhere, there is a particular kind of courage that belongs to the sailors of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, not the courage of men who did not understand the danger. They understood it completely. They knew that the maps ended. They knew that the instruments of the age were imprecise, that a miscalculation in navigation could leave a ship adrift in open ocean until the food ran out, that storms in unfamiliar waters had no precedent to prepare you for them. They knew that the sea, beyond a certain point, had never been described by anyone who had come back to describe it. They went anyway, and what they found in those uncharted waters, in those vast and rolling distances between the edges of the known world, would fill the logs and journals and sworn testimonies of the next 300 years with accounts that no subsequent age has fully been able to explain. This was the age of sail, the age in which the sea serpent stopped being a creature of ancient myth and became, instead, a recurring entry in official maritime records. The shift matters, because a sailor's log is not a poem. It is not a religious text or a political document or an entertainment. It is a legal record, written under the expectation of scrutiny, maintained by officers whose professional reputation depended on accuracy. When a ship's captain opened the log and wrote that a creature of extraordinary length had surfaced alongside his vessel at a given latitude and longitude on a given date, he did so knowing that the entry would be read by the Admiralty, by the ship's owners, by colleagues whose skepticism would be professional and unsentimental. He wrote it because it happened, because to omit it would have been, in his judgment, a dereliction of his duty to record the truth of the voyage. And they wrote it, again and again and again. Across 3 centuries of open ocean navigation, they wrote it down. The 16th century offers us some of the earliest and most detailed official accounts. In 1522, the crew of a Portuguese vessel returning from the East Indies reported a serpentine creature of enormous length encountered in the South Atlantic. The entry is brief, as log entries tend to be, but specific in its measurements and position. In 1555, the Swedish ecclesiastic and cartographer Olaus Magnus published his extraordinary Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus, a comprehensive natural and cultural history of the Nordic peoples, and devoted considerable space to what he called the great sea serpent of the Norwegian coast. He described it with a precision that reads less like mythology and more like a field observation. 200 feet in length, he wrote, 20 feet in circumference at its widest point, black, with bright eyes. It lived, he maintained, in the deep water fjords along the Norwegian coast and came to the surface on calm nights in summer, feeding at the surface before descending again. He reported that it was well known to the fishermen of the region, who avoided certain waters after dark, not out of superstition but out of straightforward practical experience with what those waters contained. Olaus Magnus was not a credulous man. He was a rigorous scholar who had spent years traveling the Nordic countries, speaking directly with fishermen, sailors, and coastal communities. He treated their accounts with the seriousness of a careful researcher, noting which details appeared consistently across independent witnesses, and which appeared only once, and therefore warranted less confidence. His Sea Serpent account is built on dozens of corroborating sources. He published it under his own name in a major work at a time when his scholarly reputation was very much at stake. He stood by it completely. Move forward into the 17th century, and the accounts multiply with the expansion of maritime trade. The Dutch East India Company alone, the greatest maritime commercial enterprise the world had yet seen, operating hundreds of vessels across every major ocean, produced a remarkable number of log entries describing large, unidentified marine creatures of serpentine form. The Dutch were practical people in a practical business. Their ship's officers were trained navigators and natural observers, men who knew what whales looked like, who had seen sharks and oarfish and giant squid, and the various other large and strange creatures that the ocean occasionally produced. When they wrote serpent, they meant that none of those other categories applied. In 1639, a creature was reported in the waters off Massachusetts by John Josselyn, an English traveler who was visiting the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and who recorded his observations of the New World with the careful attention of a trained naturalist. He wrote of a sea serpent coiled upon a rock offshore, observed by multiple colonists, described by him as being of great length and thickness, lying motionless in the sun before sliding into the water at the approach of a boat. The Boston Harbor area would go on to produce some of the most densely documented sea serpent accounts in history. But perhaps no single document from this era carries more weight than the testimony collected by the Bishop of Bergen, Eric Pontoppidan, in 1752. Pontoppidan, a learned and methodical man with no patience for folklore that could not be substantiated, spent years collecting and evaluating first-hand accounts from Norwegian sailors and fishermen for his natural history of Norway. He applied what amounted to a proto-scientific methodology to the collection of this evidence. He sought multiple independent witnesses to the same events. He cross-examined them for consistency. He dismissed accounts he found embellished or contradictory, and he retained only those he considered reliable. What he retained filled a substantial chapter, and the creature that emerged from his synthesis was detailed, consistent, and deeply strange. The Norwegian sea serpent, as Pontoppidan described it from his assembled testimony, was most commonly seen in the calm waters of late summer when the fjords and coastal channels lay flat and still in the long Nordic evening. It surfaced gradually, not dramatically, not with any apparent urgency, raising its head and neck above the water and remaining there for extended periods. Its head, witnesses agreed, was broad and somewhat flat, resembling in outline the head of a horse more than that of any fish. Its eyes were large and described in several independent accounts as being bright, reflective, catching the light, like a cat's eyes in the dark. Multiple humps broke the surface behind the neck, and the creature's total visible length, from the tip of the raised head to the last visible hump, was consistently estimated at well over 100 feet, with witnesses expressing the belief that considerably more of the animal remained beneath the surface. Pontoppidan concluded, with the measured certainty of a careful scholar, that the creature was real. He could not identify it within the existing taxonomy of known animals. He proposed no fanciful explanation. He simply noted that the accumulated weight of consistent, independently produced testimony from credible witnesses over a long period of time constituted evidence that he, as a man of reason, was not willing to dismiss. Across the Atlantic, the New World was producing its own evidence with remarkable regularity. The waters of New England, particularly the bay at Gloucester, Massachusetts, became in the 19th century what might fairly be described as the most thoroughly documented sea serpent habitat in recorded history. Between 1817 and 1819 alone, the creature was reported by well over 200 independent witnesses, fishermen, merchants, naval officers, and ordinary citizens, in a series of sightings so numerous and so consistent that the Linnean Society of New England, a scientific body of considerable standing, convened a formal committee of inquiry to investigate them. The committee gathered sworn depositions. They interviewed witnesses separately, comparing accounts for consistency. They produced a formal report that described the creature in careful, measured terms, approximately 100 feet in length, moving through the water in vertical undulations, dark in color, with a head raised several feet above the surface. Multiple witnesses independently described the movement as resembling a series of floating barrels connected in sequence. The humped, undulating back profile that had appeared in accounts from Norway, from Iceland, from the ancient Mediterranean, reproduced now in the sworn testimony of New England fishermen who had never read Olaus Magnus and had never heard of Pontoppidan. The committee found the witnesses credible. They found the accounts consistent. They found no satisfactory explanation within the known animal kingdom. Their report was published. It was debated. It was never refuted on the evidence, only disputed on principle by those who maintained that such a creature simply could not exist, which is a philosophical position rather than a scientific one. In 1848, the HMS Daedalus, a Royal Navy vessel returning from the Cape of Good Hope, encountered a creature that the ship's captain, Peter Mackay, officially reported to the British Admiralty. His report, written with the economical precision of a senior naval officer who was acutely aware of the professional exposure he was taking on, described a creature approximately 60 feet in length, moving steadily at the surface, its head raised 4 feet above the water, its color dark brown above and yellowish white beneath. It passed the ship at close range. The captain estimated they had a clear view of it for 20 minutes in good light, and none of the experienced crew could identify it. McQuay maintained in subsequent correspondence with colleagues who challenged his account that he had seen what he had seen, that he was not a man given to imagination, and that he declined to amend his report to satisfy those who preferred a more comfortable version of what the ocean contained. The Admiralty filed the report. They did not know what else to do with it, what the age of sail had accomplished in 3 centuries of extraordinary maritime expansion was something that neither the ancient world nor the medieval world had managed to produce, a body of modern, documented, sworn, multi-witness evidence for the existence of a large, unidentified marine animal of serpentine form. The captains and officers and sailors who reported these encounters were not men of the mythological age. They were men of the age of reason, of navigation, of commerce. Men for whom accuracy was a professional obligation and imagination was a luxury they could not afford on open water. They had seen something, hundreds of them, in dozens of different oceans, over the course of 300 years. And now, as that age of sail gave way to the age of steam, and steam gave way to the age of science, a different kind of witness was about to arrive. One with instruments, one with cameras, one with the tools and the training to look at the ocean, not with the eye of a sailor or a bishop or a colonial settler, but with the disciplined, rigorous, and occasionally humbling eye of a scientist confronting a question for which the existing answers were entirely insufficient. The modern age was coming, and the sea, as ever, was waiting. Chapter 3. The Modern Age. Science, Evidence, and the Question. That refuses to close science arrived at the ocean with confidence. That is perhaps the most honest way to put it. The 19th century had produced Darwin, had produced the great taxonomic projects, had produced a systematic and increasingly complete picture of the living world. And with that picture came a certain assurance that the major questions were, if not answered, at least answerable. That the framework existed, that if something large enough to be seen by hundreds of sailors across 3 centuries were genuinely alive in the ocean, science would, in due course, find it, name it, measure it, and file it appropriately. That confidence was not entirely misplaced. The 19th and 20th centuries produced extraordinary marine discoveries. The giant squid, Architeuthis dux, a creature of such improbable dimensions that its existence had been disputed for decades, was confirmed beyond argument when specimens began washing ashore in Newfoundland in the 1870s. The largest individuals measured over 40 feet in length. Prior to physical confirmation, the scientific consensus had been that a cephalopod of such size was biologically implausible. The ocean characteristically did not consult the consensus before producing one. The coelacanth, a fish believed to have been extinct for 65 million years, was pulled alive from the waters off South Africa in 1938, to the considerable embarrassment of every paleontologist who had used it as a textbook example of a species lost to deep time. The megamouth shark, an entirely unknown species measuring over 15 feet, was discovered in 1976 when one became accidentally entangled in a naval anchor off Hawaii. The giant oarfish, the longest bony fish known to science, capable of reaching lengths of over 50 feet, with a serpentine silver body and a dramatic red dorsal crest, spent centuries being dismissed as a sailor's exaggeration before enough specimens were collected to confirm that the sailors had, if anything, been conservative. The ocean, it turned out, was not finished surprising us, not remotely. And yet the sea serpent, in its classic form, remained elusive, tantalizingly, persistently, sometimes maddeningly elusive. The 20th century brought cameras, and with cameras came a new kind of witness, one whose account could be partially, if imperfectly, preserved. The problem, as any marine photographer will tell you, is that the ocean is not a cooperative subject. Light behaves differently at the surface than anywhere else on Earth. Distances are deceptive across open water in ways that confound even experienced observers. A photograph taken in a hurry on a rocking boat in the grey and glinting light of an open sea is rarely the clean and unambiguous document that subsequent analysis requires. But the photographs came nonetheless, and some of them were difficult. In 1905, two fellows of the Zoological Society of London, EGB, Mead Waldo and Michael Nicol, both trained naturalists of serious professional standing, were aboard the yacht Valhalla off the coast of Brazil when they observed a creature at close range that neither of them could identify. Mead Waldo described a large fin or frill moving through the water, followed by a long neck rising from the surface, bearing a turtle-like head of considerable size. They watched it for several minutes in good light. They recorded the sighting in their official expedition log and subsequently published accounts in the Proceedings of the Zoological Society of London. Neither man ever withdrew or modified his account. Neither offered an alternative identification. Both maintained, for the rest of their professional lives, that what they had seen was not any animal known to science at that time. That testimony, from two experienced zoologists, published in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world, has never been satisfactorily explained. In 1966, the oceanographic research vessel Anton Bruun, a serious scientific ship conducting serious scientific work, reported a large unidentified animal in the South Atlantic. In 1983, a Japanese fishing trawler brought up the partially decomposed carcass of a large unknown animal off the coast of New Zealand. A creature with a long neck, 4 fins or flippers, and a small head measuring over 30 feet in length. The photographs taken by the crew before the carcass was returned to the sea showed something that caused genuine excitement in the paleontological community, as several researchers noted a striking resemblance to a plesiosaur, a marine reptile of the Mesozoic era, presumed extinct for 66 million years. Subsequent analysis of tissue samples taken from the carcass produced an inconclusive result. The creature has never been definitively identified. The photographs remain in the public record unexplained. The scientific community, to its considerable credit, did not simply look away. It engaged, cautiously, sometimes reluctantly, but genuinely, with the question of what the accumulated evidence of sea serpent sightings might represent. Several serious hypotheses emerged, and each of them is worth sitting with. The most frequently proposed explanation is misidentification of known animals. A large oarfish seen at the surface, writhing in distress, could present as a serpentine creature of considerable length. A line of dolphins or porpoises swimming in formation, surfacing in sequence, could produce the visual impression of a single creature moving in humps. A large basking shark, which, when decomposing, loses its distinctive gill apparatus and lower jaw and assumes a long-necked, small-headed silhouette almost uncannily similar to classic sea serpent descriptions, has been put forward repeatedly as the likely culprit behind beached carcasses. These explanations are reasonable. They are not unreasonable. The ocean produces genuine illusions, and the mind of a frightened or excited observer is not always the most reliable instrument of precise measurement. But they do not account for everything. They do not account for the proximity of the sightings, the cases in which witnesses were close enough to the creature to observe specific anatomical features with clarity. They do not account for the independent consistency of reports from observers who had never communicated with one another. They do not account for Mead, Waldo, and Nicol, who were trained zoologists who knew perfectly well what an oarfish looked like. and said explicitly that this was not one, and they do not account. And this point deserves to be stated plainly, for the fundamental reality that the deep ocean remains, even now, the least explored environment on Earth. More than 80% of the ocean floor has never been directly observed by human beings or human instruments. The average depth of the ocean is over 2 miles. The deepest point, the Challenger, deep in the Mariana Trench, descends to nearly 7 miles below the surface, a distance so extreme that the pressure at its floor would crush any unprotected object to fragments in seconds. We have explored more of the surface of Mars than we have explored the floor of our own ocean. In the portions of the deep sea that have been examined, creatures of extraordinary strangeness have been found with a regularity that has become, for marine biologists, almost routine. New species of shark, new species of giant squid, new species of fish so biologically alien that their existence required the revision of assumptions about the limits of life in extreme environments. The second hypothesis, more speculative but scientifically non-trivial, is survival. The suggestion that something from the deep biological past has persisted into the present, occupying the vast and lightless lower portions of the ocean where human observation has simply never reached. The plesiosaur hypothesis is the most commonly cited version of this idea, and it has been subjected to considerable scientific skepticism, much of it legitimate. Plesiosaurs, the argument goes, would need to surface to breathe as they were air-breathing marine reptiles. Frequent surfacing would mean frequent observation. Frequent observation, in an age of global maritime traffic, would mean photographic evidence of a quality sufficient to end the debate. The absence of such evidence is a problem, and yet the ocean is very large. Maritime traffic, however extensive, covers an infinitesimal fraction of the ocean's surface at any given moment. An animal that surfaces rarely, in remote waters, at night, could plausibly do so for a very long time before a camera was pointed at it in the right conditions. This is not a comfortable counter-argument, but it is not an irrational one. Biology, like cartography, has a long history of drawing hard lines around the possible and then discovering that something was living quietly on the other side. The third hypothesis is the one that marine biologists find most scientifically productive, and it is perhaps the most unsettling in its implications. It is simply this, that what is being described in these accounts is a genuinely unknown large animal, not necessarily a prehistoric survivor, not necessarily a reptile of any known lineage, but something that evolved in the deep ocean along a trajectory we have not yet had the opportunity to document. Something that is, in the taxonomy of living things, genuinely new. The ocean has done this before. It did it with the giant squid. It did it with the megamouth. It did it with the coelacanth. There is no principled scientific reason why it could not do it again, at a scale that would, if confirmed, represent one of the most significant zoological discoveries in the history of human science. In 1977, a sonar survey of the waters off the Norwegian coast, the same waters where Olaus Magnus had written his careful account 4 centuries earlier, recorded a large, unidentified object moving at depth, far below the range of any known fish species found in those waters, at a speed inconsistent with the movement of inanimate objects carried by current. The survey operators noted it. They filed it. They did not know what it was. It remains unidentified. In 1997, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the United States, among the most rigorous and well-funded oceanographic agencies in the world, recorded an ultra-low frequency underwater sound using its network of deep ocean hydrophones. The sound, which became known simply as the bloop, was of enormous amplitude, detectable across a distance of over 3,000 miles of open ocean. Its acoustic profile was initially consistent with a biological source, something alive, something producing sound through biological mechanism. Something very, very large. Noah was careful in its public statements. It noted the biological resemblance of the profile. It noted that no known animal was large enough or present in sufficient numbers to produce a sound of that amplitude. It noted the detection coordinates and moved on. A subsequent analysis years later suggested the sound was more likely produced by icequake activity, the fracturing of Antarctic ice shelves. That explanation is accepted by most researchers, but the initial profile and the size implied by it remains a detail that the more careful oceanographers tend not to entirely set aside. We are left, at the end of 3 centuries of documentation and 1 century of direct scientific inquiry, with something that does not resolve cleanly, that refuses, with a particular stubbornness of genuinely open questions, to be filed and closed. We have consistent accounts from thousands of credible witnesses spanning 4,000 years and every major ocean. We have sworn testimony from naval officers, scientists, and trained naturalists who cannot be dismissed on grounds of credulity. We have an ocean that covers 71% of the Earth's surface, most of which we have never seen. We have a biological track record of large, significant animals hiding from human knowledge until the moment they could no longer do so, and then appearing in the record, fully formed, requiring the revision of everything we thought we knew. What we do not have is a body, a living specimen, a photograph of sufficient quality to make the debate academic. And so the question remains open, quietly, patiently, in the way that only genuinely important questions can afford to remain open, because they are not going anywhere, because the ocean is not going anywhere, because whatever moves in those deep and lightless fathoms moves on its own schedule, surfaces on its own terms, and has never, in 4,000 years of human watching, shown the slightest interest in making itself convenient. The ancient sailors knew that feeling. The captains of the Age of Sail knew it. The sonar operators and the marine biologists and the NOAA technicians who file their careful, hedged, professionally cautious notes about things they cannot explain. They know it too. That particular quality of attention that comes over you when you are watching something vast and patient from a very small boat. The sea is still there. It is still dark. It is still deep, and somewhere beneath the surface, something is still, in all likelihood, watching back. Chapter 4. The Final Descent. What the ocean still keeps, and why it matters. There is a particular hour at sea that sailors have always known by feel rather than by clock. It comes in the deep middle of the night, long after the last watch has grown quiet and the conversation has died, and the only sounds are the working of the hull and the steady breath of the wind in the rigging. The stars are out, if the sky is clear, not the pale and tentative stars of a city night, but the full and overwhelming stars of open ocean, so numerous and so bright that the horizon between sky and water becomes uncertain, and you find yourself unsure, in those slow and rocking minutes, whether you are floating on the sea or drifting through something larger. It is the hour at which the ocean feels most like what it actually is. Not a road, not a resource, not a surface to be crossed, but a world. Ancient, complete, indifferent to the small and lighted vessel moving across its face. It is in that hour, sailors have always said, that the sea gives things up, not willingly, not completely, but in glimpses, in the way that deep and private things occasionally allow themselves to be momentarily visible. A shape at the surface, a disturbance in the water ahead, a shadow passing beneath the hull that is too large and too deliberate to be current or tide, and then the water closes, and the stars are still there, and the wind is still there, and you are left with the awareness that the world you inhabit and the world that inhabits the sea are not the same world, that they share a border, the surface, that thin and trembling boundary between the air and the deep, but that below that border, The rules change in ways that human biology and human science have barely begun to apprehend. This is not mysticism. It is oceanography, stated honestly. We have spent this documentary following a thread, a single long thread, that runs from the clay tablets of Babylon to the Noah hydrophone arrays of the late 20th century, from the Norse sagas to the sworn depositions of New England fishermen, from the margins of medieval maps to the proceedings of the Zoological Society of London. The thread is thin in places, and in places it frays, and there are stretches where it disappears into the dark entirely, before surfacing again somewhere unexpected. But it has never broken. In 4,000 years of human record keeping, the thread has never broken. That means something. It is worth being precise about what it means, and equally precise about what it does not. It does not mean that every account is accurate. It does not mean that every witness saw the same animal, or that the animal they saw was necessarily what they believed it to be. The ocean produces misidentifications with generous regularity, and the human mind, even the trained, careful, professionally skeptical human mind, is not immune to the particular distortions that distance and light and expectation and fear can impose on observation. Some percentage of the accounts we have examined in this documentary have mundane explanations. Some percentage of the witnesses, however credible their general character, saw something ordinary in extraordinary conditions and interpreted it through a framework that made the extraordinary inevitable. This is not a controversial position. It is simply true. But, and here is where honesty requires us to be careful in the other direction, the existence of explainable accounts does not retroactively explain the inexplicable ones. The logic that says, some sightings are misidentifications, therefore all sightings are misidentifications, is not logic at all. It is a conclusion in search of evidence rather than evidence in search of a conclusion. And it has, over the course of the last 2 centuries, caused science to dismiss a body of testimony that deserves more serious consideration than it has generally received. Consider what we are asking ourselves to believe if we adopt the position that no large unknown marine animal exists and has ever existed. We are asking ourselves to believe that the Bishop of Bergen's carefully cross-examined witnesses, the Fellows of the Zoological Society, the captain and crew of HMS Daedalus, the 200-plus sworn witnesses of Gloucester Bay, the Japanese trawler crew with their photographs, the Norwegian sonar operators with their unexplained readings, that all of them, every one of them, across every ocean and every century, were either lying or mistaken, that the consistency of their descriptions is coincidental, that the remarkable convergence of accounts from cultures that never communicated is a function of shared human psychology rather than shared observation, that the ocean, which is still, even now, more than 80% unexplored, contains nothing that science has not yet formally catalogued. That is a very large thing to believe. It requires, in its own way, a considerable act of faith. Let us talk about what the ocean actually is for a moment. Not metaphorically, factually. The ocean covers 361 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface. Its average depth is 3,688 meters. Its total volume is approximately 1.3 billion cubic kilometers of water. Within that volume, scientists estimate that between 70 and 80% of all life on Earth exists, most of it microbial, but a significant and increasingly surprising portion of it macroscopic, complex, and large. The deep ocean, below 200 meters, where sunlight cannot penetrate, is the largest habitat on Earth. It is also the least explored. The combined total of all deep-sea submersible dives in human history has surveyed an area of the ocean floor roughly equivalent to the size of Texas. Texas, in an ocean the size of everything. Into that context, now place the question of a large, air-breathing marine animal of serpentine form, an animal, let us say, that spends the majority of its life at depth, feeding, resting, moving through the cold and lightless water at 300 or 400 meters, where pressure and darkness provide it with effective concealment from the surface world. An animal that surfaces occasionally to breathe, as all air-breathing marine animals must, but that does so at night, or in remote waters, or with the particular infrequency of a creature that has no biological need to be near the surface more than its respiratory requirements demand. An animal that, by the evidence of the accounts, is not aggressive toward humans and therefore does not draw attention to itself through predatory behavior. An animal that may number in the hundreds rather than the thousands, rare enough that its encounters with human beings represent a tiny fraction of its total movements. Is there any principled scientific reason why such an animal could not exist in that ocean? The honest answer, and to their credit, an increasing number of marine biologists will give it, is no. There is no principled scientific reason. There is absence of confirmed evidence, which is not the same thing. There is theoretical argument about how such a large animal could have avoided detection, which runs directly into the problem of how little we have actually been looking in the right places. And there is the institutional inertia of a scientific community that has, historically, found it professionally costly to take seriously the kinds of claims that the public finds exciting. A reasonable caution that has nonetheless occasionally caused science to arrive late to discoveries that the evidence, evaluated without prejudice, would have supported considerably earlier. The giant squid waited decades for confirmation. The megamoth shark spent its entire existence unknown to science until a single individual became tangled in an anchor chain. There are species of beaked whale that were formally described in the 20th century from nothing more than skull fragments. Animals that lived and bred and died in the ocean for millions of years, without a single human being ever observing one alive. And yet they were there. The ocean keeps its own counsel about what it contains. It always has. In 2012, a research team working in the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico captured the first confirmed footage of a giant squid in its natural habitat, alive and undisturbed in the deep ocean. Prior to that year, the giant squid, formally confirmed, physically measured, scientifically unambiguous, had never once been seen alive in the wild by a human observer. Not once. An animal up to 40 feet in length, present in every major ocean that had been hunted, documented, argued over, and eventually accepted for nearly a century and a half, had managed to keep its living behavior entirely secret until the technology existed to reach it in its own environment. 1 year later, in 2013, researchers off the coast of Japan filmed an oarfish, the long, silver, dramatically crested fish that is almost certainly responsible for some proportion of historical sea serpent reports, in deep water for the first time. An animal that had been washing up on beaches, alarming and confounding those who found it for centuries, filmed alive in deep water for the first time in 2013. These are not ancient history. These are recent events. This is what the ocean does, routinely, to our assumptions about what it does and does not contain. Here is what we know, stripped to its essentials. At the close of this documentary, we know that something has been seen repeatedly, consistently, across cultures and centuries and oceans, by witnesses whose collective credibility is not adequately dismissed by any explanation currently on offer. We know that the ocean is vast enough, deep enough, and sufficiently unexplored to conceal a large animal of almost any description for an indefinite period. We know that the biological record of marine discovery does not support the assumption that the ocean's large animal inventory is complete, and we know that the descriptions, when taken in aggregate, the long neck, the flat head, the dark coloration, the humped dorsal profile, the vertical undulation, the calm and curious disposition, describes something that is either an astonishing and sustained coincidence of imagination across 4 millennia, or something real. What we do not know is what it is. And that not knowing, that particular, respectful, open-eyed not knowing, is not a failure. It is, if we are honest with ourselves, one of the last and finest things the world has left to offer us. In an age in which satellite imaging can read a newspaper from orbit, in which deep-sea ROVs have filmed hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, in which the genome of almost every described species has been sequenced and studied and made available for download. In that age, the possibility that something enormous and unknown and alive is moving through the deep water of the ocean is not a source of embarrassment or frustration. It is a gift. It is the world declining to be entirely known. It is the ocean, that original and most ancient of wildernesses, keeping one more secret just a little longer. The sailors who wrote those log entries were not foolish men. They were practical, experienced, and professionally accountable, and they wrote what they saw because they believed that the truth of what the ocean contained was more important than the comfort of a world without surprises. The scientists who followed the evidence wherever it led, who published their findings under their own names, who stood by their observations when their colleagues raised their eyebrows, were not chasing fantasy. They were doing what science is supposed to do, which is to look at the evidence without deciding in advance what it is allowed to say. And the Sea Serpent itself, that long and patient and consistently indifferent creature, whatever its true nature, whatever its taxonomy, whatever the biological reality that underlies 4,000 years of remarkably consistent human testimony, has done nothing in all that time except exist on its own terms. It has surfaced when it chose to surface. It has observed the small and fragile vessels of our various ages with the unhurried curiosity of something that has been here longer than we have, and expects, in all probability, to be here considerably longer still. It has asked nothing of us. It has destroyed very little. It has, in the most literal possible sense, kept to the deep. There is something to be learned from that, if we are willing to sit with it quietly enough. The ocean tonight is the same ocean it has always been. The water that moves through the deep channels below the Pacific tonight moved through those same channels before the first human being ever stood on a shore and looked out at the horizon and wondered what was beyond it. The darkness at depth is the same darkness it has always been, complete, total, uninterrupted by any light that human beings have produced, down where the pressure is absolute and the cold is a constant, and the only sounds are the ones that belong to the deep water itself. The slow groaning of tectonic plates, the clicks and songs of cetaceans, traveling for thousands of miles along acoustic pathways that human science only discovered in the 20th century. And perhaps, moving through that darkness with the ease of something entirely at home in it, something long and dark and patient, breathing the air when it surfaces into the black and starlit night, watching the world above the water with wide eyes that catch the light, and then descending again, slowly, back into the deep. We do not know. We honestly, humbly do not know. And there is something in that not knowing, something in the simple, radical act of sitting with an open question and refusing to collapse it prematurely into either credulous belief or reflexive dismissal. There is something in that which feels, very much, like the beginning of wisdom. The sea keeps its secrets in the dark, and every now and then, in the grey light of an early morning, or in the flat and glittering calm of a summer afternoon at latitude 63 north, or in the deep and humming silence of a night crossing somewhere between one coast and another, every now and then, something surfaces. It looks, and then, as it always has, it leaves.